Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. In today's show, we're diving into the strange, quiet ways Canada lives with its ghosts. Our guest is Brian Baker, journalist and founder of the Superstitious Times, a site devoted to Canadian hauntings, investigations, and paranormal stories from coast to coast to coast. If something spooky has happened in this country, chances are it has crossed his desk. Brian has just released his first book, Eerie Whispers, exploring Canada's reluctant relationship with its ghostly lore, published by Dundurn Press. It asks a simple but unsettling question. Why is a place so full of ghost stories so hesitant to talk about them? He shares why he thinks Canada is the introvert on the global stage, and how our history, politics, religion, and politeness all shape what we're willing to say out loud about the supernatural. In our conversation, Brian keeps circling around one simple idea. The stories we tell about ghosts end up telling us just as much about ourselves. He traces that idea from a childhood encounter he has never quite shaken, through the wind-beaten coastal legends and prairie silences, to a Toronto seance that hints we might be shaping the hauntings we later claim to discover. He also brings in voices from Indigenous communities, where the presence of spirits is not an oddity, but a part of how the world works. Together, we look at what happens if Canada stops treating the paranormal as something to politely avoid, and instead lean into. Do we follow places like Salem and Edinburgh and build an open ghost culture? Or is there value in staying a little quiet, a little haunted, and a little unsure? Up next, we explore the Eerie Whispers and see what finally surfaces when Canada finally starts talking about its ghosts. But before we get to that, if you like your holidays with a little chill in the air, our nightmare before and after Xmas ghost tours are returning to the Bytown Museum in Ottawa. This is our dark holiday tradition, pulled from the Haunted Walk vault for the first time since 2019. Picture lantern light, cold nights along the Rideau Canal, and then stepping inside one of Ottawa's oldest and most haunted buildings for eerie winter folklore and ghostly Yuletide tales. Tours run on select evenings in December. If you're in Toronto, we have something special for you too. On Thursday, December 18th, Haunted Walk legend Margot MacDonald will be sharing haunted holiday stories at Curiosa. And Curiosa is a beautiful little shop filled with books, oddities, magical trinkets, and Victorian-style curios. It already feels like stepping into a story, which makes it the perfect setting for an evening of cozy, chilling tales. As you're looking for great gifts this holiday season, here's an easy win: Haunted Walk gift cards. You're not giving them another candle or a pair of socks. You're giving them a night they will actually remember. Ghost tours, dark history, paranormal investigations. And here's the best part. They choose what sounds most thrilling to them. In Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto. Zero guesswork for you, total spooky adventure for them. To purchase gift cards, tickets for the Nightmare Before or After Xmas tours, or information about any of our experiences, please visit us at hauntedwalk.com. Speaking of gifts, we'd love to make a spooky little connection with you online. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk. Brian Baker, thank you so much for joining us on Haunted Talks.
Well, thank you for having me.
Very excited to chat about your new book, Eerie Whispers, Exploring Canada's Reluctant Relationship with Its Ghostly Lore. Obviously something very personal to me, and I think a lot of our listeners as well, who are really interested in the paranormal, that we do perceive a slight difference in how we think about the paranormal or the supernatural compared to other places in the world. So I'm looking forward to diving into that with you. But I really like how the book opens. With you 4 years old, your parents take you on a trip to Vancouver Island where you saw something in the shadows. Can you share that story with us and how living with that one kind of unresolved moment shaped the way you approach the paranormal in the book, but also your career and your study of the paranormal in general?
Yeah. So, well, it was my parents that went to Vancouver Island, and they left me with a family friend. We were going through a bit of some challenging times. It was the early '80s, the recession. My dad moved us out to BC from Ontario because job prospects weren't very good. So I was at this rural house. Well, it wasn't fully rural, but there were lots of cats, dogs. The family I was staying with, they had put me in the one room with their one son. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night, the door creaking open. I'm an animal nut, so I kind of crawled to the end of the bed to see if it was a cat or a dog, and I saw that nothing was there. So I pulled myself back up to the head of the bed, and I looked in the opposite corner, and I saw this kind of black mass, and it just started to kind of take the shape of a person. I think the next thing I know is I clutched, I had a stuffed Dino from, Bedrock City, I think it was called, in Chilliwack back then, and threw the sheet over my head and fell asleep. So I think my big question is how would something that kind of jarring make me go to sleep, right? So, one person I shared that story to did mention, well, maybe you were actually having a dream when that happened, which is one explanation. I also kind of look at it as, what I saw as potentially being something that manifested from not being able to process what my parents were going through at the time, and not going into too many personal details of the family. There was a lot of stress, and then as a 3 or 4 year old, you're not really processing that stress because you don't understand it, right?
I think that's such an interesting, way to open the book, because you're already showing there may be different ways of interpreting the paranormal. As you say, just a wild dream you had, maybe the influence of stress, those kinds of things, or of course something actually paranormal or supernatural, which I think is a great way to set the stage.
Yeah, well, definitely, especially when trying to explain Canada's relationship or Canadians' relationship with the paranormal as well.
Well, let's move to that, because you have a beautiful metaphor that I really enjoyed, which is the idea of an underground river. of interest in the paranormal here in Canada that is constantly being quieted by our national tendency towards politeness and risk aversion, the things that other people in the world might say define us as Canadians. Why do you think we are so reluctant to accept or even talk about sometimes the paranormal openly, compared particularly to the US and our British cousins?
Yeah, I know it was fascinating to kind of dig deep into that. And I went to university for archaeology, but I really like the social anthropological aspect of it, and kind of exploring why Canadians are so hesitant to openly share about the paranormal and socially acceptable. I mind you, like if you're in a socially acceptable setting, people are comfortable, like a campfire, ghost walk or something like that, people will open up more. But in the general public, through pop culture, through art, we're hesitant to talk about ghosts. And I think a lot of that does kind of stem from how we developed as a country. So, we don't have Plymouth Rock. We don't have the cast-offs of Christian society from Europe coming over and settling as much. You've got the Roman Catholic influence and the mixing and blending of Indigenous and Anglican or Catholic kind of beliefs. Christianity hasn't been the big bedrock in Canada's foundation as it was in the US. So I think, for starters, our proclivity to being superstitious or supernatural isn't there as much. We've had to kind of fight against the physical nature of the environment. So animal like bears, the courrier de bois, the fur trade, and all that stuff. So I think we're more kind of reserved to accept nature, the natural environment. But when you look at our history as we are a country of treaties. We've had discussions, when we British won at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the British beat the French, and there was still an agreement. Keep the French language, Lower Canada becomes a province of Quebec. So we've always been kind of one about thinking about the other and having a positive relationship, even though, Canada is far from perfect with regards to keeping those relationships, as we know, with a lot of treaties not being observed by some of our governments now, right? But I think that aspect of talking things out, the secular kind of approach to our culture, even though religion does factor into Canadian culture, it's not as overt. And then I think the other aspect is, we've grown as a nation in the shadow of others. So we are the introvert on the global stage. And I think that's where you get that reservedness and kind of quiet leadership, lead by example.
Yeah, I've never heard that expression before, but I think it's a very apt one. We're the introverts compared to the dominant forces, the US and the UK in particular. But I think, as you know, and as all of our Canadian listeners know, Canada itself is not a monolith. And I think that is one of the best parts of the book, is you kind of take us from coast to coast to coast. And your research for the book, but also your work with the Superstitious Times, has allowed you to chat with all sorts of people across the country. And I'm curious what surprised you most about how the acceptance of the paranormal changes as you move around Canada. What are those driving influences? Is there a geographical angle, religion, as you've already hinted at, local history? Is it the combination of all of those things happen, or are there other elements we could consider into how different parts of the country believe or engage with the paranormal?
Well, it's definitely nuanced. I'll give you that. I mean, you will find pockets of very deep interest in the paranormal in BC, but I find the younger the province, the less likely it is to kind of approach that superstitious aspect, or it's a blending of cultural touchstones and stories. that seem to kind of merge together, like in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But I think the East Coast I found is the most open to the paranormal. Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and I think that probably stems from the first waves of immigrants and the early settling of those areas, bringing with them old European kind of lore like the Fae, in Newfoundland and fairy circles, and very much present. Stories like the Lutin in Quebec, and going from that kind of old world aspect. I like to kind of see the correlation, not the causation. It could be possible causation, but the story of the loup-garou, as well as the timeline of the Beast of Gévaudan, and wondering if there's causation. There's certainly correlation. But I just kind of I'd love to explore that element of that kind of lore. But then as you travel west, you see the influence of Victorian England in Ontario, in Manitoba, the spiritualist movement, of course, and in British Columbia as well. So you have that Victorian influence, and a lot of the stories, the ghost stories from places like Edmonton and Vancouver and Victoria are very kind of at arm's reach, historical. It's always historical because I think it's safer that way to share those stories, those ghost stories, whether it's Craig Derrick in Victoria, Banff Springs, that allure of the woman in white story, of course, as well as the eternal laborer Sam Macaulay bellhopping along at the hotel. The timeline does have a big impact on it. And the waves of settlers, and maybe the restraint in some of the cultures that did come over and settle in Saskatchewan and Alberta, like the German and the Polish and the Ukrainian being more reserved. So those aspects do lend themselves to the fabric of Canada. And I know I didn't really touch on that, but you've kind of brought that thought to my head because I did touch on current immigration waves as well, and how much the growth of the Muslim population in Canada has affected, as well as Caribbean diaspora and so forth. So, and that's very much a part of Canada as well, because we're very, very diverse and kind of rich in that aspect as well.
Well, let's talk about a Canadian ghost story, and one that I find endlessly fascinating. And I believe you dedicated a whole chapter to it, and that was on the Philip experiment. And this is a story we regularly share on our Campus Secrets Inspectors tour at the University of Toronto. But could you share with us kind of what that experiment was about, the results, and why it's such an important puzzle piece in Canada's connection to the paranormal?
Yeah, and it's also influenced a couple of movies too, like The Quiet Ones and The Apparition. And it's been such, I find it a huge moment in parapsychological history that Canada has contributed to the discussion. Basically, Owen, G.R.R. Owen, they created a character, Philip, of course, did a backstory. Everyone kind of had a seance, gathered around, and they kind of manifested Philip and started having conversations. And this was completely, kind of begs the question of, is this a thought form? Or is it a tulpa, of course, right? It was back in 72, 73, if I get my numbers right. That led to how much of these ghost stories is created within our mind. When you look at the Philip experiment in Toronto and how much of a role that played in explaining a lot of paranormal phenomenon and how stories perpetuate, I think when it comes to me asking questions, the first thing I ask with a haunting is there a paper trail? Is there evidence that these people were there, existed? Are there death certificates, stuff like that? You look at Banff Springs, and I know I always point this out. I love Banff Springs. I've been there once. You've got the bride in the Rob Roy room waltzing by herself. And it's that kind of provocative, almost Wuthering Heights-esque woman in white. And she's a forlorn bride because she died on her wedding day. And it's that very romanticized kind of ideal. And then you have Sam Macaulay, bellhop, but you have proof that Sam Macaulay existed. the bride story, I haven't come across any physical evidence to explain that a bride died on her wedding day inside the Banff Springs Hotel. Not exactly something you want to get out there, but there needs to be some sort of like, well, did the county morgue have the body come in, and the paperwork and all that stuff. So the Philip experiment kind of is always in the back of my head whenever I write a story. I'm very open to ghost stories and stuff like that because people are experiencing something. But the Philip experiment, to me, and reading Owen's book, of course, and his wife's book on the experiments, and of course John Robert Colombo writing about it, I think that that needs to be kind of one of those aha moments and a big moment in Canadian history.
I have a theory I'd like to run by you, which ties into the theme of your book, because the Philip experiment is just so interesting for me. The idea that potentially we can create paranormal activity through intention, which then makes me think, with places like the UK or the US that are much more embracing of the paranormal, both in the sharing of ghost stories, but also in the investigation aspect. Because if that's true, then just the very process of investigation, or like we do, going into locations and telling ghost stories, may actually amplify activity. So if Canada all of a sudden became much more interested in the paranormal, and there were a lot more ghost tours or investigations or just general dialogue about it, it seems what would follow then is more paranormal activity. And we see this on our tours. You graciously had us on the Superstitious Times to talk about our tour we launched this fall at the Brickworks, Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto. And we had a good slate of stories for that already. But what we find with any site, particularly a new one, as soon as we get in there, we will immediately have a few more things that kind of instantly happen. So I wonder if tradition in through the storytelling, through the investigations, is also playing a big role in Canada's experience, because while our ghost tours have now been around for 30 years, there's lots of Canadians who have never really engaged with the supernatural in a meaningful way. And if they did, do you think that might change activity in general or the perception of ghosts?
Most definitely. I think, and that would be a huge cultural shift for Canadians to be so, I guess, gregarious about it and openly sharing. I touch a lot on pop culture. I know a couple of people have commented on me including pop culture, but it's such a big part of the paranormal and how people perceive it. And I used two examples from pop culture that kind of play into that Philip experiment aspect. So the episode of Supernatural where they have a cabin and a bulletin board online, people are changing the story. And as they change the story on the bulletin board, the haunting changes. And the brothers go in, the Winchester brothers, and then they go in and investigate, and they find a Buddhist symbol on the other wall opposite of the Blue Oyster Cult symbol, which I thought was kind of funny. But the idea of a tulpa and it changing as people to match the time and how the story is being shared. And then, of course, the episode of the X-Files, X-Cops, where what scares people, they're going after an entity that is scaring people, but the entity changes its appearance or what it is to each person. So at one moment it's a werewolf, then it's Freddy Krueger, and then the doctor, who's rooted in very evidence-based stuff, is afraid of hantavirus. So the entity shows up as hantavirus for the doctor. So combine those kind of two worlds when people go in to investigate or visit a location, already knowing some of the backstory, but they fill in the gaps with their own kind of biases and ideas. And then that kind of changes things as well and makes it more pronounced. And people share the story, and then it just snowballs from there. I'd like going after a lot of the lesser known ghost stories that have a little bit of mystery, like the Centennial Market, Regina, Saskatchewan. So there's it changes, and as more people share the story, more activity might be pronounced. Like people, oh, there's something bumped over there. Maybe that's something happening, and like so it's very interesting. And I definitely agree with you that if Canadians start talking about it more, you will have more activity, as it were.
You brought up fear, which maybe we can discuss for a moment. I'm curious what you think the impact is. Like that episode of The X-Files, if I recall correctly, is kind of scary. And obviously all sorts of horror films related to ghosts tend to have this very frightening connotation. Now, one thing we always, on our investigations, people who are nervous always ask us, well, what if a demon follows you home or something like that? And our response is simply, well, we're not looking to connect with any demons. That's not our intent or purpose of being there. But do you think fear in the paranormal becomes a negative for people embracing it or exploring it more?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, fear definitely factors into some of the stories and Canadians. Maybe one of the other reasons why we don't talk about it is because in Western culture, we're so afraid of death and what comes after death. And I think that the greatest fear with that attachment to death is nothing happens and that's it. It's final, finite, done. Outside of Mexico and the Day of the Dead, Canada and the US are very closely aligned with that phobia of death, aging, and getting closer to the veil, right? So I think that plays huge in why Canadians avoid the paranormal, because they don't want to talk about what the paranormal or ghosts eventually lead to. In the prevailing theory is that ghosts are us passed on to the next realm, right? So I think fear both taints and creates that reservation. And I think, the US is very amped up on true crime. And I think that Canadians are more reserved out of kind of respect. So all those high profile, you have people like Zach Bagans collecting artifacts that belong to serial killers or high profile events. So he owned the La Bianca house at one point. So those moments are very kind of out there in the U.S., but Canada, nothing. They demolished the Bernardo house in Port Dalhousie that was tied to French and Mahaffey. We observe respect to the Highway of Tears, so you don't see that correlation. There are true crime moments in our ghost stories, like Mary Gallagher and the paper trail there, and then the Wendigo sickness story in Fort Saskatchewan and Alberta, of course, as well as Fantan Alley in Victoria. So those elements of the true crime are there. But Canada seems to be afraid to show that. Canadians seem to show both respect and fear of crossing the line with regards to respect to people, because people are still alive. And like descendants of these families are still alive. And I find stories like Fantan Alley and Mary Gallagher are so far in the past that it's safer to kind of share those stories, right? The Dorchester jail in New Brunswick with the two brothers who hanged, I think that's kind of getting closer and closer into that true crime aspect, where it's the 1920s, I believe, they were hanged together. As we progress further, you're not going to see more contemporary, closer in time true crime stories being relayed in ghost stories. And I think that's just out of respect. Fear, I think, how we perceive ghosts through pop culture has really affected how we see ghosts in the real world. And I think, a lot of that, you brought up demon. And I think that plays, Ed and Lorraine Warren have played a big role in that. It died down when their investigations died down, but as their estate has lent their stories to movie making, that resurgence in demon. And I think that's just kind of horror. I'm a big horror fan. And I find, and there's a great documentary by a friend of mine, Tal Zimmerman, called Why Horror? And it explores why we like to be afraid. And I think what scares us changes through time and through culture as well. So if you see a Spanish horror movie or a British horror movie, The Lady in Black by Susan Hill, terrified me. The BBC version of it, adaptation, terrified me as a kid. But, Spanish movies like The Orphanage, or India has a really rich horror movie making thing. J horror, K horror, some Korean and Japanese. Sorry for people who weren't dabbling in watching those movies. I think it changes from time to time. I think that's one of the biggest things that affects how we perceive the unknown around us is pop culture and demons.
Now, if we take the Philip experiment, which is kind of on one side of the spectrum, I guess the idea that we can artificially, maybe not the right word, but we can create a response in the environment which seems to be paranormal or supernatural. You also in the book have some profound conversations with Indigenous investigators like Aaron Goodpipe, who challenged the very word paranormal by suggesting that for Indigenous peoples, the spirit world is not paranormal, it is simply normal. I thought that was a really interesting conversation, and I'm just curious about your reflections on it, because it feels like such a good point that completely shifts, I guess, potentially our point of view. We are so reluctant, or many of us Canadians are so reluctant to acknowledge the magic of the world without the paper trail, without something very concrete. And I'm just curious in those conversations how you reflected on it, because I thought that was a really fascinating part of the book.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to really emphasize is Canada's rich history, Indigenous. It predates, of course, European colonial contact. We got a lot of these stories, of the lore and the Indigenous. And Erin Goodpipe, I originally interviewed her for a show that was on T&E, and I kept in touch with her because I did a big feature in Haunted Magazine, the UK publication, about the impact of residential schools on Indigenous spiritual beliefs. And there are, Erin was very honest and forthright and said, there are gaps. She acknowledged that she was lucky to have somebody who was able to practice the Indigenous beliefs under the radar, of course, because, Canada's less than savory history of having an Indian agent on reserves, trying to prohibit traditional practices. So that's why there are those gaps. So I think it was a very sobering, informative conversation about Indigenous people and their beliefs when it comes to the supernatural and being in touch with their ancestors. And I think that's kind of lost with Canada and, the European kind of rigidness, the Eurocentric rigidness towards that supernatural aspect. So I knew when I started the book, I wanted to definitely focus on the Indigenous, because that is a big role in a lot of our ghost stories in Canada, especially out west. It adds so much dialogue and to get those different cultural perspectives is vital to not only just parapsychological studies, but I think in general. And that's also why I spoke to the Sheik in Mississauga with regards to the Jinn as well.
My final question for you is, I've had you on the line here for quite a while. Your conclusion observes the Canadians are slowly opening up to the paranormal, younger generations perhaps shifting away from religion the influence of YouTube, social media culture, seeing more of these investigations or people with an interest in the paranormal. But you don't quite say whether this opening up is a good thing. Should Canada embrace ghost tourisms like places such as Salem or Edinburgh? Or is our reluctance maybe protecting something? Humility about unproven claims, resistance to American commercialization. After all this research and thought, where do you land on whether the question, should we be like the US and Britain, or is our quietness uniquely our own?
Well, the quietness is definitely uniquely Canadian. I definitely believe that. I use a line in it. I'm like, the Americans will capitalize on anything with a heartbeat, and in this case, without one. And I think the curiosity, and of course, Benjamin Radford, Skeptical Inquirer magazine, had mentioned that the democratization of the paranormal world and investigations kind of led to this glut of people running around in night vision. So I think people want to avoid that, and Canadians are very hung up on liability too. So with all these people going into these buildings, they don't want someone to get hurt, right? As I think I pointed out, one Spadina Crescent in Toronto, somebody was investigating something and fell off the roof and died. So, I mean, there are those moments where, is it economically feasible? And I find Canadians, it's very exemplary with the arts. If it's not going to make us money, then we don't care. And I wanted to touch more on the economics behind it, but I only had so many words, and I felt that would have been a little bit more drier conversation for the book. The openness I'm seeing there, and I think that's partially because of the shared trauma of the pandemic and exploring the afterlife, because we were most of us were flirting with that aspect, and a lot of us did experience death in the family during the pandemic. So I think that shared trauma has kind of led us to be more open. You're also seeing more secularization, pulling away from organized church. I've done a couple features on Wicca and the kind of transition and more openness to more organic belief systems that are also flexible and malleable to an individual's perspectives, as opposed to the rigidity of the Bible or the Quran or the Talmud, so yada, 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 right? It is interesting. And I do see Canadians opening up in general. I see younger people more interested in those answers. And I think our fear of death might dissolve a little bit, but just seeing how we as a culture also treat the elderly in our society is an interesting aspect to that fear of death still being there. So if we start changing how we approach aging as well, that fear of death might be muted. It will never go away because there's that fear that it's finite, but it's final. I think the conversations are there. People are opening up more. I'm seeing a lot more paranormal conferences, as well as events between museums, collaborations with groups. It's really heartwarming, actually.
We have been chatting with Brian Baker about his new book, Eerie Whispers, exploring Canada's reluctant relationship with its ghostly lore. Brian, if people are interested in getting a copy of the book published by Dundurn Press or following your work with the Superstitious Times, where's the best places for them to do that?
Dundurn Press's website, you can find Eerie Whispers on there. Just type in Eerie Whispers or Brian Baker in the search. Indigo, your local bookstore as well. Support independent bookstores. I definitely encourage that. For people listening from the U.S., Barnes & Noble, as well as your own independent bookstores as well. I had a friend in North Carolina ask me where they can get it. And I did a little quick Google search, and there's a chain of bookstores in North Carolina that are Barnes & Noble, but you can get it through there. You can also get it through me. I have a couple of books, so if you're in Toronto, you just hit me up. Superstitious Times, of course, is superstitioustimes.com, and I try to update as much as possible, providing features and articles and talking to authors about their most recent books, stuff like that, as well as documentary TV shows. It's everything Canadian and paranormal all in one.
And well worth a visit. One of my favorite sites for sure. Brian, thank you so much for joining us, and wish you, of course, as we're here kind of early December, some very happy haunted holidays this year.
Yes, so definitely partake in the Victorian tradition of sharing a ghost story.
A big thank you to Brian Baker for joining us. And of course, thanks to you for listening. This will be our final episode of 2025. So from all of us at the Haunted Walk and Haunted Talks, we want to wish you a very happy haunted holidays and a terrifying new year. If you would like to leave a little gift in our Christmas stockings, please be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. And if over the holidays, gathered around a family dinner, someone starts sharing ghost stories, we hope you'll recommend they listen to Haunted Talks. As always, a big thanks to our team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again in the new year, sweet dreams.
Yeah.